The Christmas lights were still glowing when my father stood up from his chair, lifted his glass, and turned my private life into a public transaction. His voice was calm, confident, the same tone he used in boardrooms and family meetings when he believed the outcome was already decided. He announced that my villa, the one worth $850,000, the one with only my name on the deed, would be used as collateral for a loan the family business urgently needed. He didn't ask. He didn't lower his voice. He said it like a fact everyone was expected to accept. For a split second, no one reacted. Forks paused midair. Someone gave a short, nervous laugh as if this were a joke that hadn't landed properly. The Christmas music hummed softly in the background, completely out of place. I looked at my father and said no, just one word. I didn't explain. I didn't justify myself. I said no. That was when he slapped me. The sound cut through the room, sharp and unmistakable. My head snapped to the side. Pain bloomed along my cheekbone, hot and sudden. One of my earrings flew off, bounced once on the table, then dropped into a half-filled wine glass with a hollow metallic clink. No one moved. No one said my name. The silence that followed was heavier than the slap itself. I stood up slowly, picked up my coat, and walked out of the house without looking back. Cold air hit my face as soon as I stepped outside. In my car, my hands shaking just enough to notice I made one phone call. And the most important thing to understand is this: I did not call the police. I was 31 years old, financially independent, and sitting alone in my car on Christmas night realizing that the slap itself hadn't shocked me nearly as much as the certainty behind it. My father hadn't hit me in a moment of blind rage. He had hit me because he truly believed he was entitled to what I had built. I drove home in silence, streetlights blurring past the windshield. The pain on my cheek dulled quickly, but the weight in my chest did not. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my villa, the house was dark, and still exactly the way I had left it earlier that evening. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing slowly, deliberately, grounding myself in the familiar quiet. That house had never felt like a symbol of rebellion to me. It felt like safety. I bought it after years of long hours, missed holidays, and saying no to things other people my age enjoyed without thinking. It was not an inheritance. It was not a gift. It was not tied to the family business in any way. That was exactly why my father resented it. Growing up, I learned early that independence was tolerated only when it didn't threaten control. My siblings were praised for their loyalty to the family business even when their decisions failed. I was criticized for choosing my own path even when it worked. When I bought the villa, my parents congratulated me with tight smiles and questions that sounded polite but carried an edge. Was it really necessary? Wasn't it too much for one person? Did I plan to live there alone? That night at Christmas dinner, I understood those questions had never been innocent. They had been rehearsals. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter staring at nothing. My phone buzzed once. A message from my mother. "Your father didn't mean it. You know how stressed he's been. We need to talk." I didn't answer. Upstairs, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. A faint red mark traced the line of my cheekbone. I touched it lightly, not to test the pain, but to confirm it was real. What surprised me was how calm I felt. I had expected anger, maybe tears. Instead, there was clarity. The kind that arrives when denial finally runs out of excuses. I replayed the dinner in my head, not the slap, but everything leading up to it. The way my father had kept glancing at me. The way he spoke about sacrifice and family as if he were laying groundwork. The way my mother avoided my eyes. This hadn't been spontaneous. This had been planned. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. There was no apology. Just a single sentence. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." That was when I understood what he was afraid of. Not my anger, not even my silence. He was afraid that I might refuse to step back into the role he had assigned me. I went to bed but barely slept. The house creaked softly as it settled the normal sounds of a place that had always felt secure. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and walked barefoot through the living room, touching the back of the couch, the edge of the table, the window frame. These were things I had chosen, paid for, protected. And yet my father had spoken about them as if they already belonged to him. By morning, the mark on my face had faded, but the messages had not stopped. My sister texted that I should understand the pressure Dad was under. My brother said I should have agreed temporarily just to keep the peace. No one asked if I was okay. They asked why I had embarrassed him. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, my phone face down. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for my silence. I felt observant, as if I were watching a familiar pattern from far enough away to finally recognize it. The villa was filled with soft, winter light. Outside, a neighbor walked her dog and waved. Life continued indifferent to family drama and bruised egos. And in that quiet normalcy, something shifted inside me. The slap hadn't been the worst part. The worst part was how confident my father had been that he could do it, that he could cross that line and still expect compliance. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of unchecked authority. Around mid-morning, I received a call from a number I didn't have saved. I stepped out onto the back patio before answering. The air was cold but clear. I wondered how long it would take, the woman on the other end said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. I didn't ask how she knew. I asked what I should do next. Keep doing exactly what you're doing, she said. Say nothing. Save everything. Let them think you're deciding. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were steady now. Whatever was coming next wasn't about revenge. It was about protection, about ending something that had been allowed to exist for far too long. That afternoon, my father sent another message. We can handle this quietly. There's no need to involve anyone else. Quietly. That was how things had always been taken from me. Quietly was how control survived. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the floor, I stood by the window and looked out at my yard. The house felt solid beneath my feet, not because of its value, but because it was mine. I didn't know yet how everything would unfold. I only knew this. The silence I was offering now was not surrender. It was space. And in that space, the truth was already moving steady and inevitable toward the people who thought they could use my life as collateral. The morning after Christmas arrived without ceremony, pale light slipping through the windows as if nothing in the world had changed. I woke slowly, aware of my body before my thoughts. My cheek ached, in a muted, distant way, not sharp anymore, just present enough to remind me that the night before had been real. What unsettled me wasn't the pain. It was the silence. No missed calls filled my screen, no frantic apologies. No one asking if I'd made it home safely. The quiet felt deliberate, like a collective decision had been made to wait me out. I walked into the bathroom and studied my reflection. The redness along my cheekbone had faded into a faint shadow only I would notice. When I tucked my hair behind my ear, my fingers paused. The earring was gone. I pictured it skidding across the Christmas table, landing somewhere among wine glasses and plates, abandoned without a second thought. Something small, but the symbolism sat heavy in my chest. Downstairs, I brewed coffee and sat alone at the kitchen table. The chair across from me was empty. This house had always been quiet, but never hollow. That morning, it felt like a refuge. The villa wasn't extravagant. It wasn't something out of a magazine. It was a solid, modest place in a neighborhood where people minded their business and waved politely from a distance. I bought it 3 years earlier, after my career finally crossed that invisible line from surviving to stable. I remembered signing the paperwork, my hand shaking slightly as I wrote my name. Only my name. No co-signers, no family money. When I told my parents back then, my father had paused before congratulating me, as if calculating something I couldn't see. My mother asked questions that sounded practical but never warm. How much did it cost? Wasn't it a lot for one person? Did I really need that much space? No one asked if I was happy. At the time, I brushed it off. Looking back, I recognized it for what it was. Discomfort. Not with the house, but with the fact that I didn't need permission. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me back to the present. A message from my sister. "You really put Dad in a difficult position last night. Couldn't you have talked about it privately instead of saying no like that?" I read it twice. There was no mention of the slap, no acknowledgement of what he'd done. The problem apparently wasn't the demand or the violence, it was my refusal, my timing. I set the phone face down and took a sip of coffee, suddenly aware of how steady my hands were. As the morning stretched on, I replayed the dinner in my head, not with emotion but with attention. The way my father had stood glass raised, commanding the room. The words he chose. Collateral. Loan, family business, sacrifice. He hadn't stumbled over his explanation. He hadn't hesitated. He had rehearsed it. He hadn't intended to ask me. He had intended to announce me. The slap hadn't come from anger alone. It had come from surprise. From the shock of resistance. I stood and walked through the house, noticing details I usually passed without thought. The framed print in the hallway I bought with my first bonus. The couch I waited months to afford so I wouldn't put it on a credit card. The desk where I'd spent countless late nights working so I'd never have to depend on anyone else. This place wasn't indulgent. It was earned. Growing up, the family business had been treated like a living thing. It needed attention. It needed loyalty. Everyone was expected to protect it even when it failed them. My siblings had been folded into it early, praised for their commitment, even when their decisions cost money. When they struggled, it was framed as sacrifice. When I succeeded outside of it, it was framed as excess. I chose a different path, and that choice had always been tolerated, not respected. As long as my independence didn't interfere with their needs, it was fine. The moment it did, it became a problem to solve. I opened my laptop and began scrolling through old emails, not because I knew exactly what I was looking for, but because something in my gut refused to stay quiet. I searched for the word loan. Nothing obvious. I searched my address. A few results appeared, mostly routine. One email stopped me cold. It was dated over a year earlier, forwarded to me by my father without explanation. I remembered glancing at it back then and moving on. Now, reading it carefully, my chest tightened. It referenced collateral, property, and my name. I checked the date again. It was months before anyone had ever mentioned financial trouble out loud. The realization settled slowly, heavily. Christmas dinner hadn't been the start of this conversation. It had been the moment they assumed I was cornered enough to comply. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. "Your father is under a lot of stress. He shouldn't have reacted that way, but you know how much pressure he's under. We're family. We help each other." Family. The word landed like it always had. Heavy, familiar. In my family, helping each other had always meant one thing. I give. They decide. I closed the message without responding. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. The casual questions about my mortgage, the comments about how lucky I was, the way my father had once joked that it was nice to have assets in the family, even if they weren't technically his. They hadn't noticed my villa because they cared about my comfort. They had noticed it because they needed it. I opened the folder where I kept my purchase documents and scrolled through them carefully. The deed, the title, insurance, everything was clean, clear, undeniably mine. And yet the confidence my father had shown the night before suggested he believed there was a way around that, or that there had been at some point. A chill ran through me. I thought back to other moments over the years that had felt strange but harmless at the time. The rushed signatures, the papers I was told not to worry about, the times my father said he'd handle something for me just to save time. I had trusted him. Why wouldn't I have? He was my father. But trust, I was starting to understand, can be shaped into a tool. Around noon, another message arrived, this one from my brother. "Dad didn't handle it well, but the business affects all of us. If something goes wrong, it's on everyone." I let out a short laugh that echoed through the empty kitchen. Everyone apparently except the person whose property they wanted to risk. That was when it became painfully clear. The slap wasn't the most dangerous part of the night. The most dangerous part was how easily they rewrote the story afterward. In their version, I was emotional, I was dramatic, I was unreasonable. That narrative protected them. It excused everything they'd done. I shut my laptop and stood by the window watching clouds drift slowly across the winter sky. For years I'd tried to balance independence with loyalty, believing there was a middle ground where both could exist. That middle ground no longer existed. The messages from my family continued carefully worded and strategically timed. No apologies, no accountability, just pressure. They were waiting for me to soften, to come back and smooth things over, to restore the version of me that made their lives easier. Instead, I observed. I noted who contacted me and who didn't, who expressed concern and who expressed inconvenience. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped explaining them away. By late afternoon, I returned to the email mentioning collateral. This time, I read every line slowly. There it was again. My name positioned as an option. Not a question. An option. My hands grew cold as I closed the laptop. The slap hadn't been about anger. It had been about leverage. My father hadn't been trying to punish me. He'd been trying to scare me into compliance because time was running out. This wasn't a family disagreement. It was a calculated attempt to use my life as a solution. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room, something settled inside me. Not fear, not rage. Awareness. If they were willing to pressure me, publicly minimize violence privately, and plan around me without my knowledge, then the situation was far more serious than I had allowed myself to believe. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the contact I'd added the night before. The woman whose voice had been calm when mine was shaking. I didn't call her yet. I sat there in the quiet of my own home and accepted the truth I'd been circling since Christmas dinner. This wasn't about a loan, it was about ownership. And for the first time, my father was realizing he didn't have it. I didn't sleep that night, not because my cheeks still hurt, but because my mind refused to let go of a feeling I couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger either. It was familiarity. The kind that creeps in when something terrible happens, and part of you recognizes the shape of it. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Every now and then the image of my father's face at the table replayed in my head. Not the slap itself, but the moment just before it. The certainty, the expectation, the way he had already decided what my answer should be. That feeling was not new. Sometime after midnight, I got up and padded barefoot into the living room. The floor was cold. I wrapped my arms around myself and stood by the window watching my own reflection blur against the dark outside. I realized then that what kept me awake wasn't what he'd done, but how easily it fit into a pattern I had spent years refusing to see. I had been here before, not at a Christmas dinner, not with a raised hand, but in moments that had always been framed as help. When I was 19, my father had offered to handle my first financial aid paperwork. "It's complicated," he'd said. "I've done this before." I remembered sitting at the kitchen table while he flipped through forms pointing to where I should sign. I trusted him. I didn't read everything. Why would I have? He was my father. Years later, when I opened my first retirement account, he insisted on being there. Just to advise, he said. I remembered how quickly the meeting moved, how the advisor spoke mostly to him, how I nodded along grateful and a little intimidated. At the time, I told myself that was what support looked like. Standing in my living room now, I felt the weight of those memories shift. What I had once labeled as care began to look a lot like control. The next morning, the feeling followed me into the daylight. I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately. Coffee, shower, clean clothes. Everything felt normal, and yet my thoughts kept circling the same question. How many decisions had been made around me without me ever realizing it? I sat at my desk and opened my laptop again, not to search for anything specific, but to trace the outline of my own history. Emails, attachments, scanned documents I had never paid much attention to. I wasn't looking for proof, I was looking for patterns. And once you start looking, patterns have a way of revealing themselves. There were emails where my father had been copied unnecessarily, threads where he answered questions addressed to me, Documents sent for my records after decisions had already been finalized. None of it screamed wrongdoing on its own, but together it told a story I hadn't wanted to hear. I remembered how often I had been told, "Don't worry about it," whenever I asked too many questions. How easily that phrase had soothed me. How quickly I had learned that not worrying made things smoother for everyone. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. There was a moment from my early 20s that came back to me with unsettling clarity. I had been offered a job out of state. A good one. I remembered my father's reaction, how he smiled tightly and asked practical questions. How days later he sat me down and explained why staying close to home made more sense. How he framed it as concern. I had turned down the offer. At the time, I told myself it was my choice. Now I wasn't so sure. That afternoon, I met a friend for lunch. She wasn't part of my family's orbit. She knew my work, my humor, my independence, but not the mythology of our family business. When I told her carefully about Christmas dinner, she didn't interrupt. She didn't excuse anything. She just listened. When I mentioned the email that referenced my property, her brow furrowed. "Did you authorize that?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was complex, but because no one in my family had ever asked it. Authorization had never been part of the conversation. Things simply happened, and I was expected to accept them. "No," I said slowly. "I didn't." She nodded once, her expression serious. "Then that's not a misunderstanding. That's a problem." The simplicity of it took my breath away. I drove home thinking about that word, problem. Not family drama, not stress, not a rough patch, a problem. That evening, I pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old folders, paperwork from my early adulthood, things I had saved without really organizing. I spread them across the dining table, sorting them into piles. There it was again. A signature that looked like mine but wasn't quite right. A date that didn't line up with where I knew I had been at the time. An approval I didn't remember giving. My heart began to pound, but I forced myself to stay still. Panic wouldn't help me. Panic would make me careless. What terrified me most wasn't the possibility that something had been done without my consent. It was the realization that my silence had made it possible. I thought about how often I had been praised for being easy, for being understanding, for not making things difficult. Those compliments had always felt like love. Now they sounded like strategy. The slap at Christmas dinner took on a different meaning under that light. It hadn't been the start of something. It had been the breaking point, the moment when the usual methods failed. I understood then why my refusal had provoked such a violent response. It wasn't just defiance, it was a disruption. For the first time, I wasn't confused. I wasn't seeking reassurance, I was observing. Over the next few days, I noticed things I would have missed before. How my father's messages shifted in tone depending on how quickly I replied. How my mother's concern always circled back to the family business. How my siblings avoided specifics while urging me to be flexible. No one asked me what I wanted. They asked what I was willing to give. Late one night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my phone hovering over my father's contact. For a moment, I considered calling him, demanding answers, forcing a confrontation. But something held me back. If there was one thing I had learned, it was that people who operate in the shadows move quickly when they know they've been seen. If I confronted him now, whatever trail existed would disappear. So I did something that felt unnatural and powerful at the same time. I stayed silent. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of attention. I documented everything, screenshots, dates, names. I stopped reacting and started recording. Every message, every voicemail, every carefully worded attempt to steer me back into line. And in that quiet, I felt something else shift. Guilt loosened its grip. In its place came a steadiness I had never felt before. This wasn't about proving my father wrong. It wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. Because if my name had been used once without my knowledge, it could have been used before. And if my silence had ever been mistaken for consent, then the truth wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood in my kitchen and looked around my home, the walls, the floors, the space I had built for myself. For the first time, I saw it not just as a place to live, but as something I had defended without even realizing it. I picked up my phone and opened the contact I had added on Christmas night. The woman whose voice had cut through my shaking hands with calm precision. I didn't call her yet. I wasn't ready to act, but I was ready to know. And once you start seeing the pattern, once you understand how long it's been there, you can never unsee it again. I opened the folder again that morning, telling myself I was only going to skim. Just a quick look, just enough to reassure myself that everything was where it should be. The villa was quiet, wrapped in that late winter stillness that makes every sound feel deliberate. The papers lay spread across the dining table edges, a lined sunlight brushing over them as if they were harmless. Deeds, insurance forms, closing statements, documents I had signed, read, and remembered. Then there was one page that didn't belong. At first I couldn't say why. It looked ordinary enough. Same font, same letterhead, same formal language that had always made my eyes glaze over. But something in me paused. The date was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong enough to itch. I sat down slowly and read it again, this time line by line. There was an addendum attached to the main agreement, a supplemental clause referencing potential use of the property as collateral under specific circumstances. The language was careful, almost elegant. It didn't say the villa would be used. It said it could be made available if certain conditions were met. And next to that clause was a signature. My signature, or something that was supposed to be. I stared at it for a long time, my coffee cooling untouched beside me. The name was mine, written in a familiar slant, but the pressure was off. The rhythm was wrong. It looked like my handwriting the way a mirror looks like a face, close enough to fool someone who wasn't paying attention. I tried to remember signing it. I couldn't. That alone wouldn't have frightened me. Memory is slippery. We forget small things all the time. But this wasn't small. I remembered every document tied to the purchase of my home. I remembered sitting across from the closing attorney. I remembered the weight of the pen. I remembered the exact moment I exhaled after signing the last page. I did not remember this. A chill settled into my chest, slow and deliberate. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I simply sat there listening to the sound of my own breathing, letting the realization take shape. This wasn't a misunderstanding. I flipped back through the rest of the paperwork, searching for context. The addendum referenced a meeting I had no memory of attending, a consultation that had allegedly taken place months after the purchase. According to the document, I had agreed to allow preliminary discussions with a financial institution regarding potential collateralization. Preliminary discussions. The phrase made my jaw tighten. It was vague enough to sound harmless. It was also specific enough to open a door. I pushed the papers aside and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My heart began to pound, not with fear but with recognition. I had felt this before. The sense of something being decided just outside my field of vision. I thought back to the times my father had called me into his office growing up, not to ask for my opinion, but to inform me of a decision that had already been made. How often I had nodded, trusting that he knew best. Trust leaves fingerprints. Silence leaves permission. I reached for my phone and hesitated. Calling my father would have been easy. I could have demanded an explanation, watched him scramble for a story. But instinct stopped me. Confrontation would warn him. Whatever trail existed would disappear the moment he knew I had found it. Instead, I did something that felt both small and monumental. I called the number on the letterhead. The woman who answered spoke professionally, her tone polite and neutral. I didn't give my name right away. I asked general questions. Hypothetical ones. About procedures. About how collateral discussions were initiated. When I finally mentioned my address, there was a pause. Just a fraction of a second. Enough. Yes, she said carefully. That property was referenced in preliminary documentation last year. My grip tightened around the phone. Referenced how? She hesitated again. As a potential asset. I thanked her and ended the call before my voice could betray me. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in, not with threat but with clarity. This wasn't a future plan. This was an ongoing one. The Christmas dinner hadn't been an impulsive demand. It had been the final step in a process that had already begun. I thought about how confident my father had sounded that night, how certain he had been that the villa was available. That certainty hadn't come from hope, it had come from preparation. I went back to the table and picked up the addendum again, reading it with new eyes. The language was technically legal, carefully constructed. It didn't say I had agreed to anything irreversible, but it also didn't say I hadn't. That was the danger. I could see it now. How silence could be interpreted as consent. How trust could be translated into authority. How my absence from conversations had been framed as permission to proceed. I remembered the way my father had waved away my questions over the years. Don't worry about it. I'll handle it. This is easier if you let me take care of it. Easier for whom? By early afternoon, my phone buzzed again. A message from my mother. Have you had time to think your father is very worried? We don't want this to become something it doesn't need to be. I read it without reacting, then set the phone down. The irony made me almost laugh. They were worried about escalation, not because of what they had done, but because of what I might do if I stopped staying quiet. I spent the rest of the day organizing, not emotionally, logistically. I scanned documents, created backups, labeled files with dates and notes. I wrote down everything I remembered, everything I didn't. That night, as the sky darkened outside my windows, I realized something that made my chest ache. This wasn't the first time they had tested the boundaries of my autonomy. It was just the first time I had noticed. The slap at Christmas dinner replayed in my mind, but now it looked different. It wasn't the act of a man who had lost control. It was the reaction of someone who felt control slipping. He hadn't expected resistance. He had expected compliance reinforced by years of conditioning, and when that didn't happen, he had lashed out. The more I thought about it, the more the urgency made sense. Loans don't wait. Banks don't negotiate with emotion. Something had reached a breaking point, and my property had been positioned as the solution long before anyone bothered to ask me. I walked through the house again, touching familiar surfaces, grounding myself in the physical reality of what was mine. Not just the walls and floors, but the life I had built without their help. For the first time, fear crept in. Not the fear of losing the house, but the fear of how close I had come without knowing it. I sat on the couch and stared at my phone, my thumb hovering over the contact I had added days earlier. The woman whose voice had cut through my shock with calm authority. I thought about what she had said. Say nothing. Save everything. Let them think you're deciding. Now I understood why. If they knew I had found the paperwork, they would adjust, reframe, bury. The addendum would become a misunderstanding. The email would become an oversight. The narrative would shift as it always had. Silence was no longer weakness. It was cover. I sent myself one last scan and locked the originals away, sliding the folder into the safe I had installed after moving in, never imagining I would use it for this. The click of the lock echoed in the quiet room, final and grounding. As I turned away, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. Let's sit down and talk. No lawyers, just us. I didn't respond. Instead, I sat in the darkened living room and let the truth settle fully into place. This wasn't about family tension. This wasn't about stress. This was about a man who believed that because he had once guided my life, he was entitled to claim it when he needed it most. And the most dangerous part wasn't the paperwork. It was how close he had already come to making it work. She arrived exactly on time, which told me more about her than any introduction could have. I was already seated when she walked into the small cafe, winter coat neatly folded over one arm, posture straight, but unassuming. She scanned the room, once spotted me immediately, and approached without hesitation. There was no warmth in her smile, but there was no coldness either, just clarity. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't mention Christmas. She sat down, placed her folder on the table, and said the first thing that mattered. "What documents do you have?" Not "do you need help?" Not what happened. What documents? I slid my phone across the table and unlocked it, opening the folder of scans I had made the night before. She didn't reach for it right away. She watched my hands, my face, the way I breathed. Only when she was satisfied that I wasn't panicking did she begin to look. Her eyes moved quickly, efficiently. She didn't react to the addendum. She didn't raise an eyebrow at the signature that wasn't quite mine. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if confirming something she already knew. "You're not imagining this," she said. The words landed with unexpected weight. I hadn't realized how much energy I had been spending wondering if I was overreacting, misremembering, exaggerating. In one sentence, she stripped that doubt away. She closed the folder and finally looked at me directly. This didn't start with Christmas dinner. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. She introduced herself then briefly. A financial attorney, an independent advisor, someone who had spent years cleaning up messes created quietly inside families who thought blood made them untouchable. She didn't represent my parents. She never had. But she knew my father's name well enough to recognize patterns. "He's tried something like this before," she said. "Just not with someone who noticed." I asked her how bad it was. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked a different question. "Did anyone ever explain to you why your name appeared in preliminary loan discussions last year?" "No," I said. "I didn't even know it had." She nodded as if checking off a box. "That's consistent." Consistent with what I wanted to ask, but she was already continuing. "The loan your father is trying to secure isn't new. It's been in trouble for a while. The lender requested additional collateral months ago. Your property was flagged early on as an option not because it was convenient, but because it was clean. No liens, no shared ownership, low risk." My stomach tightened. "He couldn't use it without your consent," she continued calmly. "But he could prepare, draft documents, reference it in discussions, create a paper trail that made it seem like agreement was forthcoming. So Christmas was—" I started. The pressure point, she finished. "The moment he thought he could push you across the line." I thought of the slap. The shock on his face when I said no. The certainty crumbling in real time. That slap, she said, as if reading my thoughts, wasn't about anger. It was about leverage. The words sat between us, heavy and exact. "He lost control of the narrative in front of witnesses," she went on. "That's why it escalated. Not because you embarrassed him, because you disrupted the plan." I stared down at my coffee untouched. "So what do I do?" She leaned back, slightly studying me. "You don't confront him. You don't accuse him. You don't tell anyone what you found." My heart began to race. "Then how do I stop it?" "You don't stop it," she said gently. "You let it expose itself." She explained it slowly, methodically, the way someone does when they know the listener needs to feel every step. The documents prepared without my explicit consent. The references made prematurely. The urgency now driving my father's behavior. None of it was illegal yet, but all of it lived dangerously close to the line. "If he believes you're still undecided," she said, "he'll keep moving forward. And that's when mistakes happen." "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind that don't survive scrutiny." I looked up at her. "And my role in this?" She met my gaze evenly. "Your role is to protect yourself. Nothing more, nothing less." There was something deeply unsettling about how calm she was. No righteous anger, no dramatic warnings. Just facts. "You should also understand this," she added. "If you had signed that night even temporarily, even just to help undoing it, would have been extremely difficult. That's why the pressure was public. Witnesses make coercion harder to prove." My hands curled into fists beneath the table. She watched the reaction but didn't comment on it. "You did the one thing he didn't plan for. You walked away." I asked her why she had come so quickly that night, why she had been willing to involve herself at all. Her expression shifted slightly. Because I've seen this end badly. And because your father underestimated something. What? Your independence. He assumed you'd come back and negotiate emotionally. He didn't anticipate silence. That word again, silence. It's your strongest asset right now, she said. Use it. She outlined what would happen next. The lender would continue asking questions. Timelines would tighten. My father would grow more anxious, more careless. All I had to do was remain exactly as I was, calm, distant, uncommitted. And if he asks directly, I said. You say you're still thinking, she replied. Nothing more. I nodded slowly. It felt counterintuitive, almost passive. But I trusted her not because she promised victory, but because she respected boundaries. As we stood to leave, she paused. One more thing. I waited. There's a reason he panicked when you said no, she said quietly. And it's not just the loan. There are older decisions tied to this. Things you were never meant to revisit. My chest tightened. Like what? She didn't answer. She simply handed me her card. When you're ready to know, you'll ask the right question. That evening back in my villa, I sat alone in the living room replaying the conversation. Nothing had been resolved. No justice had been served. And yet, for the first time since Christmas, I felt grounded. My phone buzzed. A message from my father. We need to talk soon. Time is important. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed a reply. I'm still thinking. I set the phone down and leaned back. My heart steady, my mind clear. For the first time, the silence wasn't something done to me. It was something I was choosing. And somewhere beneath the surface of that quiet, I could feel the truth shifting, preparing to rise. I couldn't stop hearing her voice in my head. This didn't start with the house. For days after our meeting, that sentence followed me through every room of the villa. I heard it when I poured coffee in the morning. I heard it when I locked the door at night. It didn't sound accusatory. It sounded factual, which made it worse. I had spent so much energy protecting what I had built that I hadn't questioned what might have been taken long before the villa ever existed. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, I pulled a chair into the walk-in closet and reached for the box on the highest shelf. It was heavier than I remembered. A cardboard archive of my younger self. Inside were folders I hadn't opened in years, their labels written in a version of my handwriting that felt distant now. College paperwork, old tax forms, insurance statements, things I had saved out of habit, not suspicion. At the bottom of the box was a thin manila envelope with my name typed neatly across the front. Not handwritten, typed. That alone made my stomach tighten. I sat on the floor and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of documents related to a trust. I frowned reading the header again. A trust established years ago when I was still a teenager. My name appeared as a beneficiary. The amounts listed weren't small. They weren't life-changing millions, but they weren't insignificant either. Enough to matter, enough to notice. And yet I had no memory of this. No conversations, no meetings, no explanation of how it worked or what it was for. I had never received statements. I had never been asked how I wanted it handled. According to the paperwork, everything had been managed. Managed by my father. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, not tears, yet just the threat of them. I forced myself to keep reading. There were amendments, adjustments over time, language about restructuring for efficiency, about consolidating assets for the good of the family. My name appeared again and again, always in the passive sense. Beneficiary, dependent, future consideration, never decision maker. I leaned back against the wall documents spread across the floor and stared at the ceiling. My heart beat slowly, heavily, as memories began rearranging themselves. I remembered being told casually that some money set aside for me had been used temporarily during a difficult year for the family business. I remembered being reassured it would be made whole again. I hadn't asked questions. I was young. I trusted that adults knew what they were doing. Later, when I was in my early 20s and struggling to pay off student loans, I remembered my mother saying how proud she was that I was learning responsibility. That struggle builds character. Now, holding those papers, the irony was suffocating. I thought about my siblings, how easily they had stepped into roles within the family business, how their risks had been cushioned, how their mistakes had been absorbed, quietly rewritten as investments. Favoritism hadn't been loud, it had been logistical. I picked up my phone and stared at it for a long time before finally dialing the number on the card the woman had given me. She answered on the second ring. I found something I said. She didn't ask what. She asked how old I had been when it was created. 17, I said after checking the date. There was a pause. Not surprise, confirmation. That explains a lot, she said. I told her about the trust, about the amendments, about how I had never been informed of changes. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sighed softly. I was hoping it wasn't that. What does that mean? I asked. It means this isn't just about financial pressure now, she said. It's about a pattern that's been in place for a long time. She explained it carefully. How trusts created for minors often give parents wide discretion. How that discretion can be abused under the guise of family necessity. How things can be technically legal while being ethically indefensible. And the worst part, she added, is that it's often framed as protection, not theft. I closed my eyes. So he didn't steal from me. He redirected, she corrected, repeatedly. And because you trusted him, there was never resistance. The word landed harder than I expected. Resistance. I had never resisted. I had adapted. I had worked harder. I had built my life under the assumption that nothing would be given freely, and in doing so, I had made myself easier to overlook. Does this connect to the loan, I asked? Yes, she said, without hesitation. The same logic applies. He sees your assets as part of a shared pool, something to be allocated where needed. Your independence disrupted that system. The villa hadn't created the problem, it had exposed it. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. I didn't feel angry the way I thought I would. I felt hollow, as if something I had always assumed was solid had quietly dissolved. I thought about how often my father had praised me for being self-sufficient, how proud he'd sounded when telling others that I never needed help. That pride hadn't been admiration. It had been relief. I was easy to extract from without consequence. The slap at Christmas dinner re-entered my mind, but now it belonged to a much longer story. It wasn't an isolated act of violence. It was the final assertion of a belief that had guided years of decisions, that my boundaries were flexible, that my silence was agreement, that my success was communal property. I gathered the papers and placed them back into the envelope, my movements slow and deliberate. I wasn't ready to show them to anyone yet, but knowing they existed changed everything. Later that night, my father called again. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. His voice sounded tired, strained, but still authoritative. "We need to resolve this," he said. "You're making things more complicated than they need to be." Complicated? The word felt familiar. I had been accused of that before, usually when I asked for clarity, when I wanted time, when I didn't fall in line quickly enough. I didn't return the call. Instead, I opened my laptop and began writing a timeline. Dates, events, decisions. Not just about the villa, but about everything I could remember that involved money consent and my name. The picture that emerged was unmistakable. I had not been excluded because I was incapable. I had been excluded because inclusion would have required permission. Sometime past midnight, I stood at the kitchen window watching the reflection of my own face hover over the dark glass. I looked older than I felt. Or maybe I finally looked as old as I was. I wasn't grieving money. I was grieving the illusion that my autonomy had ever been respected. And yet beneath that grief, something steadier was forming. Understanding. The woman had been right. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming authorship, about ending a cycle that depended on my compliance to survive. I picked up my phone and typed a message to her. "There's more. Older than the house." Her reply came quickly. "I know, and when the time comes, it will matter." I set the phone down and breathed deeply, letting the weight of that settle. The slap had been loud, public, shocking. But what had been taken from me before that had happened quietly behind closed doors wrapped in language meant to sound responsible. I understood now why my refusal had terrified him. It wasn't just the loss of a villa, it was the loss of access. And once that door closed, it would never open again. When I told my mother I would come to dinner, the pause on the other end of the line was so brief she probably thought she had hidden it. She hadn't. I heard the relief slide into her voice immediately after warm and practiced like a door opening back into a familiar room. "That's good," she said. "Your father will be glad. We all just want to move forward." Move forward. The phrase carried no curiosity about what I needed, only reassurance that the discomfort I had caused might finally be smoothed over. I agreed to come without conditions, no apologies demanded, no boundaries announced. I let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe. That time had softened me. That silence meant hesitation, that I was coming back into line. The house looked the same when I arrived. Warm lights glowing through the windows, familiar wreath on the door, the smell of food drifting out before I even knocked. It was comforting in a way that almost made me forget why I was there. Almost. My father opened the door himself. He smiled wide and controlled and leaned in to hug me. His arms were stiff, his touch careful as if testing whether I would flinch. I didn't. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. The living room was already full. My siblings sat together on the couch, conversations hushed the moment I entered. My mother hovered near the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel that was already clean. No one mentioned Christmas. No one mentioned my cheek. The absence was deliberate. Dinner was laid out beautifully. Candles, polished silverware. Everything arranged with intention, as if order on the table might restore order everywhere else. I took my seat where I was directed, the same chair I had occupied my entire life. The placement wasn't accidental. My father waited until plates were filled and glasses poured before he spoke. "I'm glad you're here," he said, raising his glass. "Families go through things. What matters is that we don't let them divide us." I nodded politely and took a sip of water. Conversation flowed around me, careful and shallow. My siblings talked about work, about projects, about things that didn't matter. Every now and then one of them glanced at me, eyes searching for cues. Was I calm? Was I angry? Was I ready to comply? My father watched me closely, but not openly. He had always been good at reading rooms. He leaned back in his chair, confident again, like a man who believed the storm had passed. Halfway through the meal, he brought it up. Not directly, never directly. "You know," he said, casually cutting into his food, "the situation with the business is stabilizing. Still delicate, but moving in the right direction." No one looked at me, but everyone listened. "There are still some decisions to be made," he continued. "Timing matters. But with cooperation, things tend to work out." I met his gaze for the first time that evening. "I'm sure they do." He smiled. "I knew you'd understand." That was the moment I realized how deeply he had misread the silence. My mother reached over and touched my hand. Her fingers were warm, pleading. "We don't want stress to ruin relationships," she said softly. "You've always been sensible." Sensible. The word had followed me my entire life. It meant I didn't push, I didn't demand, I didn't complicate. I smiled faintly. I'm still thinking things through. My father nodded, satisfied. "Of course, no rush. We just wanted to make sure you felt supported." Supported. By a room full of people who had watched me be struck and chosen comfort over truth. The meal continued. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then louder. Wine was poured again. The tension eased. My father relaxed visibly, his shoulders dropping, his voice growing more animated. He talked about plans, about future opportunities, about how everything would be easier once this small hurdle was cleared. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. My phone vibrated softly in my pocket. I didn't look at it right away. Instead, I studied the room, the lighting, the way my father sat at the head of the table, the way my siblings deferred to him without realizing it, the way my mother kept glancing between us, trying to anticipate needs that were never spoken. This was the stage, carefully arranged, perfectly familiar. The phone vibrated again. I excused myself calmly and stood up. "I just need to take this," I said. No one objected. My father nodded graciously, already certain nothing important would interrupt his evening. I stepped into the hallway and checked the screen. "I'm on my way," that was all it said. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned to the table, my expression unchanged. The shift in me must have been subtle because no one noticed. My father resumed talking, his confidence fully restored now. He leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "If we handle this the right way," he said, "there won't be any need for outsiders. We can keep it in the family." I didn't respond. My silence emboldened him. He began outlining next steps, hypotheticals framed as inevitabilities. He spoke about meetings, about signatures, about timelines. Each word was chosen carefully, designed to guide rather than force. He thought the hardest part was over. The doorbell rang. The sound cut through the room, cleanly sharp and unexpected. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. My mother's startled hand flying to her chest. My siblings looked toward the door, confused. My father froze, just for a moment. In that moment I saw it. The flicker of recognition, the calculation, the sudden unmistakable fear. "I'll get it," my mother said, standing too quickly. "No," my father said, rising from his chair. "I will." He moved toward the door with forced composure, smoothing his jacket as he walked. The rest of us remained seated, the air thick with unasked questions. When he opened the door, he stopped. The woman standing there didn't raise her voice. She didn't smile. She didn't rush. She simply looked at him with the calm authority of someone who had nothing to hide. "Good evening," she said. "I believe we need to talk." My father's face drained of color. For a second he tried to recover. He laughed lightly as if greeting an unexpected acquaintance. "There must be some mistake," he said. "This is a private family dinner." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "That's exactly why I'm here," she replied. She turned her attention to the room, to the table, to the faces now staring openly. Her gaze settled on me and she gave the slightest nod. Not reassurance, confirmation. My father closed the door slowly behind her. "What is this?" my mother asked, her voice thin. The woman placed her bag on the sideboard and looked directly at my father. "It's about a loan," she said evenly, "and a property that doesn't belong to you." The room seemed to shrink. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced at me, his eyes sharp, searching for help. For the first time in my life, he needed me to intervene. I stayed seated. "This isn't the time," he said finally. "We can discuss this later." She shook her head once. "You've already tried that." Silence fell again, heavier than before. My siblings shifted uncomfortably. My mother's hands trembled. No one spoke. The woman reached into her bag and removed a folder, placing it gently on the table. "I won't take much time," she said. "But there are some things that need to be clarified. Now." My father's confidence collapsed in real time. His posture sagged, his authority cracked. And as I watched him stand there exposed and unraveling, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not revenge. This was consequence. And the silence I had chosen had brought it right to his doorstep. The room didn't erupt. It didn't explode into shouting or chaos. It went unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that makes every breath sound too loud. The woman remained standing, hands resting lightly on the edge of the dining table, as if she were about to begin a presentation rather than dismantle a life. My father stayed where he was, half between the door and his chair, caught in a posture that revealed too much. He hadn't planned for this. Not tonight. Not like this. "I don't understand why you're here," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. If this is about business, it can wait. She didn't look at him when she answered. She looked at the table, at the place settings, at the faces around it. It can't, she said, because this is where the pressure was applied. My mother's voice trembled. What pressure? The woman finally turned her expression neutral, the kind that relies on family silence. She opened the folder and slid the first document onto the table, face up directly in front of my father. It was a clean copy, neatly printed with highlighted sections that drew the eye immediately. This is a preliminary loan application, she said calmly. Submitted under your name. It references a property owned solely by your daughter. My brother leaned forward. That's not possible, he said quickly. She never agreed to that. That's correct, the woman replied. She didn't. My father cleared his throat. These are just discussions, he said. Nothing binding. Exploratory. Exploratory discussions still require disclosure, she said, especially when they involve collateral you don't own. I watched his hands. They had gone still. Completely still. He wasn't angry anymore. He was calculating, trying to figure out which version of the truth might survive. My sister spoke up, her voice uncertain. Dad, what is she talking about? He turned to her, relief flickering across his face at the chance to reassert control. It's complicated, he said. You wouldn't understand all the details. The woman interrupted him gently. She doesn't need to. What matters is that the documents imply consent that was never given. She placed a second page on the table, this one a familiar addendum, the one with my almost signature. I felt my chest tighten as several sets of eyes flicked between the page and me. That doesn't look like her signature, my brother said slowly. My father laughed sharp and brittle. Of course it does. She signs things all the time. You're reading too much into this. The woman met his gaze. We had a handwriting analyst review it. The word analyst hung in the air, heavy and final. My father's face changed. Not dramatically, subtly. His jaw tightened. His shoulders drew back, defensive now rather than authoritative. You went behind my back, he said, turning toward me. I spoke for the first time since she had arrived. My voice surprised even me. It was steady. You went behind mine first. The table seemed to hold its breath. The woman continued unfazed. This property was referenced multiple times over the past year in communications with the lender. Each time it was framed as an option that would be finalized shortly. That's not what happened, my father snapped. I was trying to protect my family. By risking your daughter's home without her knowledge, she replied. That's not protection, that's exposure. My mother covered her mouth with one hand. Is this true? She asked him quietly. He didn't answer her. He looked at me again, this time openly pleading. You know I would never hurt you, he said. You know everything I've done has been for this family. The woman stepped in before I could respond. Intent doesn't override impact, and family doesn't nullify consent. She placed another document on the table, this one thicker, heavier. Because of these discrepancies, she said the lender has halted the loan process pending a full review. My father's breath hitched. That's not necessary, he said quickly. We can clear this up. This is a misunderstanding. It's already been escalated, she said, quietly, but thoroughly. The shift in the room was unmistakable. Chairs creaked as people adjusted. The illusion that this was a private matter dissolved completely. My brother looked at my father with something new in his eyes. Not loyalty, apprehension. You used her house, he said slowly, without telling her. My father shook his head. I was going to tell her. That's what tonight was about. I met his gaze. No, I said. Tonight was about cornering me. Silence followed, not stunned silence, understanding silence. The woman nodded once. Public pressure often creates compliance. That's why it's used. My father stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. This is ridiculous, he said. You're all overreacting. Nothing happened. That's the problem, she replied. Too much almost happened. She turned to me, then addressing the room but anchoring her words to my presence. Your daughter is the sole legal owner of her property. Any attempt to use it as collateral without her explicit consent constitutes misrepresentation. My mother sank into her chair. This review, the woman continued, will examine not only this loan but prior references to assets not owned by the applicant. My father's voice rose. You can't do that. She looked at him evenly. We already are. For the first time, he lost his temper completely. This is betrayal, he shouted, gesturing wildly. After everything I've done, after everything I've sacrificed. No one responded. No one rushed to soothe him. He looked around the table, searching for the support that had always materialized before. It didn't come. The woman waited until his voice faded. We'll be in touch, she said. There are processes now. She gathered her folder movements unhurried. Before leaving, she turned back once more. And for the record, she added this didn't come from her seeking revenge. It came from her protecting herself. She looked at me again, her gaze steady. That matters. Then she was gone. The door closed softly behind her. The aftermath was worse than shouting would have been. My father sank back into his chair, suddenly smaller. My mother stared at the tablecloth fingers twisting together. My siblings avoided looking at either of us. I stood. I'm leaving, I said. No one stopped me. As I walked toward the door, my father spoke again, his voice hoarse. You've ruined us. I paused, hand on the handle. No, I said quietly. I just stopped you from ruining me. Outside, the night air felt clean, sharp, bracing. I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs. Behind me, a system had cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. And as I walked away from the house, I knew something else with absolute certainty. The moment my father lost control wasn't when the woman walked in. It was when everyone in that room realized he had been lying the entire time. I slept through the night for the first time since Christmas, and when I woke up, the quiet felt earned. Morning light spilled across the bedroom floor, soft and unhurried. My phone lay face down on the nightstand, exactly where I had left it. I didn't reach for it right away. I lay there for a moment, listening to the house breathe, noticing how my chest rose and fell without tension. The absence of dread was unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Downstairs, the coffee maker hummed as it always did. The routine felt grounding, ordinary, in a way that reminded me life still existed beyond family drama and legal fallout. I stood at the kitchen window mug, warming my hands, watching a delivery truck crawl down the street. Somewhere else, people were starting normal days, unaware that my world had quietly shifted on its axis. My phone buzzed once. I let it sit. When I finally looked, there were 3 missed calls and a handful of messages. All from family, none from my father directly. That more than anything told me how bad things were. The first message was from my brother. What happened last night was serious. The bank called this morning. They're freezing everything until further notice. Freezing everything. The words carried weight. They meant meetings canceled, decisions delayed, authority suspended. For someone like my father, that was a kind of exile. Another message followed this one from my sister. Dad is furious. He says this could destroy the business. I stared at the screen, then set the phone back down. The business had survived decades of risky decisions, strategic favors, and quiet rearrangements of responsibility. If the truth threatened to destroy it, that said more about its foundation than my involvement. Mid-morning, the woman called. It started, she said without preamble. I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. The lender initiated a formal review late last night, she continued. They've requested documentation going back several years, not just related to your property. My grip tightened on the phone. How far back? Far enough, she said. This won't be quick. I exhaled slowly. And my role. You stay exactly where you are, she replied. You don't engage, you don't explain, you don't soften anything. I thought of my mother's trembling hands, of my father's last accusation. "They're blaming me." "They would," she said calmly. "It's easier than accountability." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and let the reality settle. The confrontation was over. What came next was quieter, slower, and far more consequential. By afternoon, the ripples were impossible to ignore. A cousin texted fishing for information. An aunt left a voicemail that sounded sympathetic but vague. People who had never shown interest in my life suddenly wanted updates. I didn't respond to any of them. Around 2 o'clock, my father finally called. I watched the phone vibrate on the table, his name lighting up the screen. For a long moment, I considered letting it ring out. Not out of fear, but because I knew exactly what he would say. I answered. "You've gone too far," he said, immediately skipping any greeting. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the authority it usually carried. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," I said. "This was a private matter," he snapped. "You humiliated me." I closed my eyes. "You humiliated yourself." A sharp intake of breath on the other end. "After everything I've done for you," he said, his voice rising, "this is how you repay me." There it was, the old script: sacrifice, obligation, debt. "I didn't do this," I said evenly. "I stopped it. You let outsiders tear this family apart." "No," I replied. "I refuse to let you use my life to patch your mistakes." Silence crackled between us. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted, pleading now. "You could fix this," he said. "You could make a statement. Clarify things. Tell them there was a misunderstanding." I imagined it. The narrative he wanted. The version where I was confused, emotional, mistaken. Where he was benevolent and burdened. "No," I said. "You're choosing this," he accused. "I'm choosing myself," I replied. He hung up without another word. I sat there staring at the wall, my heart pounding, but my resolve intact. For the first time, his anger felt small. Later that day, my mother called. Her voice was quiet, brittle. "People are asking questions," she said. "Things are coming up we didn't expect." "I know," I said gently. "Your father is beside himself." I said nothing. She sighed. "Couldn't you have handled this differently?" I thought about the years of silence, the trust, the compliance. "I did handle it differently," I said. "I handled it honestly." She didn't answer. As evening fell, more information filtered in through fragments. The review wasn't limited to the current loan. Other transactions were being examined. Old arrangements, reallocated funds. Decisions once buried under phrases like family necessity. The system my father had built relied on one assumption: that no one would ever question him. That assumption was gone. I walked through the villa as the sky darkened, turning on lamps one by one. The space felt unchanged, solid, grounded. The same walls that had sheltered me during uncertainty now held something else. Relief. I thought about my siblings, how confused they must feel watching the ground shift beneath the man they had always deferred to. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance, the kind that comes when you realize someone else's awakening isn't yours to manage. That night, the woman sent a brief message. "They've removed him from direct negotiations for now." I stared at the words. Removed him. The image that followed surprised me. My father standing outside a room he had always controlled, listening to muffled voices, making decisions without him. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. Days passed. The review deepened. Meetings happened without him. Advisors spoke carefully. Language shifted. What had once been framed as leadership was now being examined as liability. Family gatherings were canceled. Conversations grew strained. People took sides quietly, strategically. Loyalty moved toward stability. Through it all, I remained where I was. One evening, my brother stopped by unannounced. He stood in my doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes tired. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know," I replied. He hesitated. "Things are bad." I nodded. He looked around the house, then back at me. I never thought he'd do something like that. I met his gaze. I did. I just didn't want to believe it. He left soon after without asking for anything. As the week ended, I received one final update from the woman. "There's something else," she said. Older. Related to a trust. It hasn't surfaced officially yet, but it will. I thought of the envelope in my closet, the documents I hadn't shared. "I'm ready," I said. When the call ended, I stood alone in my living room watching the city lights flicker on outside. Somewhere my father was dealing with consequences he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Somewhere the truth was unfolding without my intervention. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had stepped aside and let reality do what it always does eventually. It reveals. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not because the story was over, but because it no longer belonged to me to carry. When everything finally slowed down, I expected to feel victorious. I expected a rush some moment where the weight lifted and I could say it had all been worth it. Instead, what arrived was quiet. Not empty, just still like the air after a storm has passed and left behind things you now have to look at. I sat alone in the living room one afternoon, the light coming in low and golden, and realized no one was calling anymore. Not to argue, not to accuse, not to negotiate. The silence was complete, and for the first time it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like permission to breathe. I thought about the word revenge and how easily people use it, how neat it sounds from the outside, as if there's a moment where you strike back and everything balances itself. That wasn't how this felt at all. There was no satisfaction in watching my father lose his footing, no joy in hearing that meetings were happening without him, no pleasure in knowing his authority had evaporated. What I felt was distance. Distance from the chaos. Distance from the role I had been playing for so long without realizing it. Distance from the version of myself that believed endurance was the same thing as strength. I walked through the villa slowly, not checking locks, not scanning for threats, just moving. The house no longer felt like something I had to defend. It felt like a place I could exist without bracing myself. That difference mattered more than anything else that had happened. There were things revenge did not give me. It did not give me an apology. My father never called to say he was wrong. He never admitted what he had done. He reframed it, minimized it, blamed pressure and circumstance. When that stopped working, he went quiet. The apology I once thought I needed never came, and surprisingly I no longer needed it. Revenge did not give me my old family back. Whatever illusion I had carried of us being united by loyalty or mutual respect was gone. Some relationships thinned out naturally. Some conversations never restarted. Holidays would be different now. Smaller, quieter. I grieved that more than I expected. Not because I wanted things to go back to the way they were, but because I had to let go of the version of family I had spent years hoping for. The one where love didn't come with conditions, where help wasn't transactional, where silence wasn't demanded as proof of belonging. Revenge did not erase the memories. The Christmas table, the sound of the slap, the way no one stood up for me. Those moments didn't disappear just because the power dynamic shifted. They stayed reshaped by context, but still present. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about no longer organizing my life around those moments. One evening, the woman called to check in. "Do you regret it?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unexpected, but because I hadn't asked it myself yet. I thought about it carefully before answering. I thought about the nights I'd spent awake, the relationships strained, the quiet judgment that now hovered around my name in certain circles. "No," I said finally, "but I don't feel triumphant either." She exhaled softly. "That's usually a sign you stopped at the right place." We talked for a while, not about documents or processes, but about aftermath. She told me something that stayed with me. Justice ends behavior, she said. Revenge tries to end pain. Those aren't the same thing. After the call, I sat with that distinction. Justice had ended something, the access, the entitlement, the assumption that my life could be used as a solution to someone else's mistakes. Revenge would have required me to keep engaging, keep pushing, keep defining myself in opposition. I hadn't done that. I had stepped away. That choice came with losses, but it also came with something I hadn't felt in years. Neutral ground. I no longer woke up anticipating conflict. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I no longer felt the low-grade anxiety of waiting to be asked for something I didn't want to give. There was sadness, yes, but it wasn't sharp. It was honest. I thought about my father not as the figure who had controlled the room, but as a man whose entire sense of self had been tied to authority. Losing that didn't just strip him of power. It exposed fear. I didn't excuse what he had done, but I understood it more clearly now. Understanding didn't mean reconciliation. It meant release. There were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night when the house was quiet and my mind wandered. Could I have handled it differently? Could I have softened the blow? Could I have saved something by sacrificing a little more of myself? Each time the same answer returned. If I had softened it, it wouldn't have stopped. It would have paused. That realization steadied me. Revenge did not give me closure in the way movies promise it. There was no final conversation that wrapped everything up neatly. Closure came in pieces, in mornings without tension, in evenings where I didn't check my phone compulsively, in the simple act of making plans without considering how they might be received. I began to notice small things again. The sound of my own laughter, the way my shoulders relaxed when I sat down, the fact that I no longer felt like I was borrowing my own life. The villa reflected that change. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It was just a home. I rearranged furniture, cleared out drawers filled with old documents and emotional clutter. I let light in. I stopped bracing for impact. People asked how I was doing cautiously, as if unsure what version of me they would get. "I'm fine," I said. And for the first time, it wasn't a performance. I thought about how many years I had equated loyalty with silence, how often I had swallowed discomfort to keep things smooth, how easily that habit had been mistaken for consent. That stopped with me. Revenge did not give me back what had been taken quietly over the years: time, trust, certain opportunities. But it did give me something else, something quieter and more durable. It gave me the certainty that my boundaries were real. I didn't need to defend them aggressively. I didn't need to justify them endlessly. I just had to honor them. As the days passed, the noise around my family softened. The review continued. Consequences unfolded at their own pace. I wasn't involved in any of it. That separation felt intentional, necessary. I wasn't watching from a distance. I was living elsewhere. One afternoon I stood on the back patio, a mug of tea cooling in my hands, and realized I hadn't thought about the slap in days. Not because it had faded, but because it no longer defined the present moment. It had become context, not control. That was the difference. Revenge didn't heal me. But refusing to be pulled back into the cycle did. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, I understood something that felt like the final lesson of all of it. The real victory wasn't exposing him. It was choosing a life where I no longer had to explain myself to anyone who believed love meant ownership. That was what revenge did not give me, and what walking away finally did. I woke up one morning and realized I hadn't checked my phone in over an hour. That alone told me something fundamental had changed. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and unhurried, touching the walls of the villa, in a way that felt almost intimate. There was no jolt of anxiety in my chest, no instinctive scan of messages to see who might be angry, disappointed, or demanding something from me. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It was neutral, spacious. I stayed in bed a little longer than usual, not out of exhaustion, but because I could. For years, mornings had started with preparation, emotional armor, a mental checklist of what might go wrong, who might need managing. That morning, there was nothing to manage. Downstairs, I made breakfast slowly, not multitasking, not planning conversations in my head. Just the sound of the kettle, the smell of toast, the quiet rhythm of a life that no longer felt reactive. I sat at the kitchen island and ate without scrolling, noticing how rare that had become without me ever realizing it. The villa had changed too, though not structurally. It was still the same walls, the same floors, the same view from the windows. What had changed was how I inhabited it. It no longer felt like a place I needed to justify owning or protect from someone else's entitlement. It felt like a place that accepted me without conditions. That week I started making small changes. Not renovations, just edits. I removed a bookshelf that had always felt too heavy for the room. I cleared out a drawer filled with old paperwork I no longer needed to keep as proof of anything. I moved a chair closer to the window because I liked how the light fell there in the afternoon. Each decision felt quiet but deliberate. No one needed to approve it, no one needed to understand it. I realized then how much of my life I had lived explaining myself, why I made certain choices, why I didn't want certain things, why my boundaries existed at all. Explanation had become a reflex, as if my autonomy were something provisional. That reflex was gone. Messages from my family still came occasionally, but they had changed in tone. Less insistent, more cautious. Some were purely informational updates I didn't ask for. Others were tentative testing whether I might re-engage. I responded when I felt like it, briefly, without emotional labor. Distance, I learned, was not cruelty. It was clarity. One afternoon I met a woman from my neighborhood for coffee. We had exchanged polite greetings for years, but never really talked. Now, with nothing pulling me urgently in another direction, I found myself lingering. We talked about work, about aging parents, about how strange it felt to realize certain patterns only after stepping outside them. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't need to. I noticed that I was choosing connection based on safety rather than obligation, and that felt new. Money began to feel different too. Not in amount, but in meaning. It was no longer a measuring stick of worth or a lever others could pull. It was simply a tool, one that allowed me to say no without panic to plan, without fear to rest, without guilt. I sat down with a financial planner of my own, choosing not because something was wrong, but because I wanted transparency. Ownership, I learned, wasn't just legal, it was informational. I asked questions, I took notes, I understood every answer. The calm that came from that knowledge was deeper than any reassurance I'd been given before. My family, meanwhile, stayed where they were, not frozen in time, but separate. I no longer felt the urge to check in to smooth things over, to absorb discomfort for the sake of harmony. Harmony built on erasure was no longer something I could participate in. I thought often about Christmas dinner, but not with the sting it once carried. It felt distant now, like a photograph you've studied enough times to stop reacting to. I could see it clearly, the dynamics, the assumptions, the moment when everything finally surfaced. I understood now that I hadn't become stronger after the slap. I had simply stopped allowing myself to be treated as flexible. That distinction mattered. There were moments of sadness, of course. Grief doesn't disappear just because you choose yourself. I grieved the parents I wished I had. I grieved the idea of a family that could celebrate success without resenting it. I grieved the years I spent thinking endurance was proof of love. But grief didn't feel like failure anymore. It felt like release. One evening, the woman who had helped me navigate everything stopped by briefly. Not for business, just to check in. We sat on the back patio, the air warm, the sky fading into evening. "You look different," she said. "I feel different," I replied. She nodded. "That's what happens when you stop explaining yourself." After she left, I stayed outside for a long time, listening to the neighborhood settle. Lights flicked on in nearby houses. Somewhere a dog barked. Ordinary life unfolded without my involvement, and for once that felt comforting. I realized then that healing hadn't arrived as a dramatic turning point. It had arrived as permission. Permission to live quietly. Permission to take up space without apology. Permission to define family success and peace on my own terms. The villa, once a symbol of conflict, had become something else entirely. It was no longer proof of independence. It was simply where my life happened, where I laughed, rested, planned, and existed without surveillance. I thought about the future not in terms of what I needed to defend against, but in terms of what I wanted to build. The thought didn't scare me. It didn't feel heavy. It felt open. As I went inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of the lock was no longer an act of protection. It was routine, unremarkable, safe. That was the greatest shift of all. I hadn't rebuilt my life from ruins. I had stepped into it fully for the first time, and for the first time that felt like enough. When I think back to that Christmas night now, the memory no longer tightens my chest. It sits quietly in my mind, like a marker on a map. This is where everything changed, not because I was hurt, but because I finally stopped moving the line to make other people comfortable. I remember the table, the lights, the sound of my earring hitting the glass. For a long time I thought that moment was about humiliation, about being reduced in front of people who were supposed to love me. But distance has a way of clarifying things. That night wasn't about shame. It was about revelation. It showed me exactly how far my boundaries had already been crossed long before a hand was ever raised. What truly changed after that night wasn't the loan or the investigation or even my relationship with my family. What changed was something quieter and more permanent. I stopped asking myself whether I was allowed to say no. For years I had believed that being reasonable meant being flexible, that being loving meant being accommodating, that being a good daughter meant absorbing pressure without complaint. I had confused endurance with virtue, silence with maturity, but there is a difference between compromise and surrender. And I had been surrendering for a long time without calling it by its name. The villa was never the point. Not really. It was just the first thing valuable enough that my refusal could no longer be ignored. When I said no to using it as collateral, I wasn't just protecting a property. I was protecting the last part of my life that still belonged entirely to me. And when that protection was challenged publicly and violently, the illusion collapsed. In the weeks that followed, I didn't seek punishment for my father. I didn't pursue revenge in the way people imagine it. I didn't raise my voice or demand apologies that would never come. I did something far more unsettling for people who rely on control. I withdrew my permission. I stopped smoothing things over. I stopped absorbing blame that wasn't mine. I stopped stepping forward to rescue situations I didn't create. And without my participation, the system that depended on me began to fail on its own. That is something we don't talk about enough. How often dysfunction survives not because it is strong, but because someone keeps carrying it. When I stopped carrying it, the weight didn't disappear. It simply fell back to where it belonged. There were moments when that choice felt lonely. Moments when I wondered if I had gone too far. Moments when old habits whispered that maybe I should reach out, explain myself, restore the balance. Those voices were familiar. They had kept me compliant for years. But each time I sat with the discomfort instead of trying to fix it, something unexpected happened. The discomfort passed, and in its place came clarity. I learned that boundaries do not require consensus. They do not require understanding. They do not require permission from the people most threatened by them. They only require one thing: that you hold them. I didn't lose my family that night. What I lost was the version of family that only worked when I made myself smaller. And once I saw that clearly, I could no longer pretend it was love. Love does not demand silence in exchange for belonging. Love does not use fear as leverage. Love does not strike when it doesn't get its way. The hardest part of this journey wasn't the confrontation. It wasn't the exposure. It was accepting that the people who taught me about family were also the ones who taught me to ignore my own limits. Letting go of that contradiction was painful, but it was also freeing. Today my life is quieter, not empty, just unburdened. I wake up without bracing myself for conflict. I make decisions without rehearsing explanations. I spend time with people who don't ask me to earn my place in their lives. The villa still stands solid and unremarkable just as it always did. But now it represents something different. Not independence proven to others, but safety defined by me. When I lock the door at night, it isn't because I'm afraid of someone taking something from me. It's because I choose what stays inside my life and what doesn't. That choice is the real revenge, if you want to call it that. Not destruction, not humiliation, not winning, but refusal. Refusal to be collateral. refusal to be managed, refusal to be silent when silence only benefits someone else. If you're listening to this and something feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know this. You don't need a dramatic moment to justify drawing a line. You don't need evidence strong enough to convince everyone else. You don't need to wait until the cost is unbearable. You are allowed to protect what you've built. You are allowed to say no even when it disappoints people who expected your compliance. You are allowed to choose peace over performance. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining yourself and let the truth speak through your absence. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose yourself over family expectations or draw a boundary that changed everything? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you appreciate stories about justice, dignity, and finding strength without losing your humanity, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, and I'd love for you to be here when they do. Thank you for listening. And remember, the moment you stop letting others decide your worth is the moment your life truly becomes your own.